So, how confident are you that the Gospels are historically reliable accounts of the words and deeds of Jesus? You've had a chance to think about that. It's an important question, and it's one that even Christians need to grapple with. Let me go further and ask you this. How confident are you in the accuracy of these Gospels when the earliest Gospel was written 35 to 45 years after the events took place? Many of you, perhaps most of you, are staking your lives on the accuracy of these Gospels. Are you sure that human memory is reliable that long after? I mean, I wouldn't stake my own life and my ability to remember what I had for lunch yesterday. So how can we be confident the words and deeds of Jesus were well remembered and passed on accurately until they reached the gospel writers? Like the warning of the London Underground subway, we need to mind the gap. We need to mind the gap. This 35 to 45 years is a large gap in time that's separating the events of Jesus' life and the writing of the Gospels. What happened to the memories of Jesus during that time? Well, you need to know that for a century, critical scholars have been saying that because the Gospels vary so much in their details and were written so long after the events, that they must have undergone numerous changes and additions as they circulated among the early Christian communities. Critical scholars assume this is what normally happens to human memories and stories circulating for 40 to 50 years in different countries, told in different languages, among people who had no contact with any eyewitnesses or anyone else who had. So they assert that we cannot simply take for granted that the Jesus of the Gospels truly corresponds with the real historical Jesus who lived in first century Jewish Palestine. Reconstructing the real historical Jesus, they contend, would require that each story and each saying in the Gospels be individually assessed for its historical authenticity. Well, critical scholars have attempted such an assessment, and not that long ago, a highly publicized group of critical scholars known as the Jesus Seminar has stated that no more than 18% of the sayings of Jesus and 16% of the deeds of Jesus can be historically validated. Question is, are these scholars right? Did the words and deeds of Jesus really pass through 40 years of careless memory before they reached the gospel writers? You know, if they did, we may as well dismiss the Gospels as nonsense and get on with our lives. But is that really what happened to the memories of Jesus? Well, there are many historical Jesus scholars who would argue that is not what happened. New studies on the role of eyewitness testimony, oral tradition, and memory in the development of the gospel tradition have shed enormous light on how the Gospels, by ancient standards and conventions, can be deemed very stable and reliable despite their variability and this long gap in time between the events of Jesus and their composition. And I want to share with you now some of this new scholarly research in the hope that your own confidence in the historical reliability of the Gospels will be strengthened. So let's begin with the role of eyewitness testimony in the development of the gospel tradition. As was stated in the opening questionnaire, the Gospels of Luke and John explicitly claim to be based on eyewitness testimony, while critical scholars doubt this claim. They admit there were eyewitnesses from whom traditions of Jesus originated, but they assume these eyewitnesses had very little to do with those traditions after they set them going. They left them in the hands of the communities to work out their significance. But this assumption is really not supported by the historical evidence. And I want to highlight for you 3 pieces of evidence for this. First, we have an early 2nd century report written by a bishop named Papias, who clearly indicates the eyewitnesses were present and active in the early Christian communities all the way to the writing of the Gospels. The report reads as follows: "And if by chance someone had been a follower of the elders should come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter said, or Philip, or Thomas, or James, or John, or Matthew, or any other of the Lord's disciples, and whatever Erastian and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying. For I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and abiding voice." Now, Papias is referring to a time around 80 AD, when he himself was collecting oral reports of the words and deeds of Jesus. Most scholars believe that elders in this report refers to church leaders who knew the named disciples in this report. But others believe elders actually could refer to the disciples themselves, and therefore Papias had direct contact with them. But in either case, it makes little sense that Papias would be interested in hearing from the disciples at all if they had left the scene after they set the traditions of Jesus going, as the critical scholars assume. It is far more likely Papias preferred to hear their testimony, whether directly or through the elders who knew them, because the disciples were present and active in the early Christian communities all along, and they were serving as the authoritative sources and guardians of that tradition. That's the first piece of evidence. Second piece of evidence. What Papias did in consulting eyewitness testimony was actually the standard practice of Greco-Roman historians. Swedish scholar Samuel Bierskog discovered from his thorough research on ancient history writing practices that all the ancient historians wanted to hear from those who had direct experience of the events and who were involved participants in those events. Ancient historians had little interest in hearing from people at second or third hand or from collective memories of communities. They adhered to Heraclitus's old dictum, eyes were surer witnesses than ears. So what does this tell us? It tells us that Luke and John and Papias were not acting any differently from other ancient historians. Third piece of evidence. The gospel writers actually reveal their eyewitnesses in the same way that Greco-Roman historians did. Richard Bauckham, in his monumental book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he highlights several ways the gospel writers do this. But one convention worth noting is the practice of inserting in their accounts the names of the eyewitnesses they consulted. Now, have you ever wondered why the Gospels mention so many people specifically by name? Well, this is because historians did this so that the eyewitnesses would vouch for the things that they had written. And this is an interesting observation. Key eyewitnesses are especially prominent in ancient historical accounts. Their prominence served to alert the reader of the author's principal sources. Now, if you think about the Gospels, it's actually quite easy to identify who these chief eyewitnesses are. The most prominent figures in touch with the person of Jesus are the 12 disciples, and among them, standing out, is Peter. In fact, he's a towering figure in all four Gospels. He's always standing out as the leader. He's mentioned 3 times more than any of the other disciples. This is a signal to the reader that Peter is the chief eyewitness. Now, the early church clearly acknowledged this with the Gospel of Mark. You may not have known this, but several early church fathers, including Papias, state that Mark's Gospel is a collection of Peter's sayings. But there is also good reason to believe that Peter's teaching stands behind the Gospels of Matthew and Luke as well. Most scholars agree today that Matthew and Luke used Mark's Gospel to compose their own because more than 80% of their Gospels are a reproduction of Mark, in some parts verbatim. So if Mark is indeed a collection of Peter's sayings, it logically follows that Peter is the principal source of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Now, I have to say that it's very difficult to account for any of these traces of eyewitness testimony in the Gospels if the eyewitnesses weren't around during these years leading up to the writing of the Gospels, as the critical scholars assume. It's far more reasonable to assume that Peter and the 12 were the authoritative sources and guardians of the tradition all the way up to the time the Gospels were written. So that's just some of the evidence for the role of eyewitness testimony in the development of the Gospel tradition. Now let's consider the role of oral tradition. In ancient times, oral tradition was the most common way to pass on important information. That's by hearing it and repeating it aloud, also with degrees of precision and flexibility. This is how the words and deeds of Jesus were passed on until they were written down. Now, in our modern age, we have a hard time believing this way of communicating could be reliable because we assume it's like the telephone game. But the evidence shows that cultures relying on oral tradition actually remember things very well. Professor Kenneth Bailey's research among traditional Middle Eastern communities revealed what is currently considered today the closest model of the oral tradition practices employed by the early Christians. For over 3 decades, Bailey observed what he called informal, controlled oral tradition in the context of an evening village gathering for the telling of stories and the recitation of poetry. The oral tradition is informal, he says, because there's no official teacher and no specifically identified student. Anyone can theoretically participate, though the older, more gifted, and socially more prominent men tend to do the reciting. The reciting is controlled because the community has boundaries and limitations to preserve the tradition. For example, only those who have grown up in the community have the right to recite. Stories and poems are always told publicly in the village gathering. Some recitation is verbatim, but others allowed for individual interpretation and variation in some details, provided the central threads of the story remain intact. And if a single word is missed or wrong, or important content is significantly altered, the reciter is corrected by a chorus of voices from the community who assist him from their collective memory. Bailey observed, with this level of fixity and flexibility on retellings, a story can endure 100 transmissions through a chain of 101 different people, and the inner core of the story remains intact. Now, I stated earlier that one of the reasons why critical scholars doubt the historical reliability of the Gospels is because parallel accounts in the Gospels vary significantly in their details. But N.T. Wright and James Dunn, 2 giants in historical Jesus research, insist that this informal controlled model of oral tradition is very useful in understanding why these differences exist. Core or key features of the gospel tradition were told and retold in a fixed manner, but there is room for flexibility in minor details. There is, however, one important difference between the Middle Eastern communities Bailey observed and the early Christian communities that actually makes the oral tradition of Jesus even more reliable. And that is that the early Christian communities didn't rely on community controls alone. They had the eyewitnesses who were there, active, present, formally passing on and guarding the tradition making sure that Jesus' words and deeds were remembered rightly all the way up until the Gospels were written. In fact, it was probably partly the dying out of this group of people that prompted the Gospels to be written. The traditions, they had to be preserved beyond the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, and so the Gospels were produced as a record of their testimony. So now, let me just sum up these two. Given the way important information was passed on and preserved orally in ancient times, and the evidence that I've shown you of the presence of the eyewitnesses actively passing on and guarding the tradition, based on these two factors alone, there is good reason to be confident that the memories of Jesus were accurately passed on for 35 plus years until the Gospels were written. Now, in closing, let's consider memory, the role of memory. Can we really trust the memory of the eyewitnesses to retain the amount of information that is in the Gospels for that long? Given our common experiences with the frailties of memory, forgetfulness, remembering things differently, distortions, it's not unreasonable to question its reliability to recollect memories of events that happened 35 to 45 years ago. But despite how flawed my memory is now, I can still remember details of events that I witnessed or experienced 45 years ago. For example, 45 years ago, I was living in Canada on a small farm, and in the middle of winter, my appendix burst, and I ended up in the hospital with peritonitis, and I almost died. Now, if you asked me and my parents and my three brothers to come together and share our memories of that event, there would be some variation in how we all tell the story. But you can be confident of this. There would be a fixed core of information as well. It would be something like this. Peter's appendix burst, and he nearly died. Now, why do you suppose we remember that event? Because it was an extraordinary day in my life. And it was. Now, imagine this, that my family recited this event repeatedly every week for the last 40 years. If we did that, there would certainly be significant agreement in how each of us tells the story. Now, here's the rub. The events, the deeds, the teachings of Jesus were inherently more memorable than my appendectomy. They were unusual. They were significant. They were landmark and life-changing events that would have stuck in the people's memories, especially the disciples' memories. And given the robust nature of oral tradition, which I just shared with you, these memories would have been reinforced and stabilized by frequent rehearsal, being told and retold after the events were witnessed, and become a part of the shared memories of those closest to Jesus. Richard Bauckham has a chapter on recent psychological research on recollective memory, and in this chapter he demonstrates that the memories of the disciples would score very high by the criteria used to establish the reliability of recollective memory. And Robert McIver's recent work on eyewitness testimony supports Baukham's thesis. His research reveals that the margin of error in eyewitness testimony is about 20%, and he assumes from these results that the disciples' testimonies would have had errors. But in their case, McIver contends, the margin would have been even lower given the way the memories of Jesus were passed on and preserved in the early Christian communities. McIver also says he's not concerned much at all with those errors because memory studies also reveal that 20% margin of error, it's only in peripheral details, not central features. So in the final analysis, McIver is confident that most of the details are indeed factual and can be relied upon to form a well-informed, broad picture of what Jesus did and said. For him, it would be very difficult to imagine the eyewitness accounts would have been changed or embellished to the extent that the critical scholars claim. Now, in closing, let me just say this. we can agree that absolute certainty in the reliability of the Gospels may not be achievable by historical standards. But I hope you can see from what I've shared with you about the active presence of the eyewitnesses, the robust nature of oral tradition, and the reliability of memory regarding extraordinary events, it's very reasonable by historical standards to have a high level of confidence in the reliability and truthfulness of the Gospels. And that is why many historical Jesus scholars have that high degree of confidence today.